Hi there, and welcome to the next of our AUT Online vidcasts as part of our new media journalism course. This week I spoke to Dr. Martin Hirst, our own curriculum leader in the journalism program here at AUT University, about his area of specialisation, which is the digital world and how it affects the political discourse of the day. I started off by asking Martin just what he meant by these terms digital optimist and digital pessimist.
I think the digital optimists are people who actually have thought now for some time that the internet and the web and the rise of citizen journalism and user-generated content is actually going to undermine the power, if you like, of the old media barons, people like Rupert Murdoch and so on, and the Disneys and the Vivendis of the world who have dominated the old media now for the last 20 or 30 years. And they see the rise of citizen journalism as a way of undermining that and perhaps a new democratic life, if you like, of the web. The digital pessimists are people who actually point out things like the amount of surveillance that goes on the web. For example, every time you go to a website, it plops a little cookie on your hard drive, so it remembers you. Spyware, all that kind of stuff that exists in this kind of dark recesses of the web. And in fact, not only that's used for kind of semi-criminal purposes, but also the amount of data that is collected on people by banks, by government agencies, by virtually anybody you do business with over the web, and even by Google. I mean, you click on the yes, I accept your terms and conditions button without perhaps realizing how much information is being kept about you and what rights you are signing over to Google to deal with that information, to sell it to people, to give it to police agencies and state organizations. So I think the optimists would see a bright future for the web. The pessimists are a bit more gloomy than that.
Where do you sit?
Well, I have some sympathy for the digital pessimists, I must say. I've coined a little slogan that I use, and I call it pessimism of the internet, optimism of the web. And I take that from an Italian intellectual called Antonio Gramsci, who talked about pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And what he meant by that was that you can fully understand and search the world and study the world and understand what's happening around you, and in the context of capitalism, it looks gloomy. The future doesn't look very bright. However, as a kind of socialist who believes in a bright future for humanity, optimism of the will means that you actually still retain some sense of balance, if you like, and some idea that the future can be better if people organise and if people actually fight back against repression, for example. In terms of how I translate that to the web, pessimism of the internet really means we should be aware of the fact of what Google and those kinds of mega corporations are able to do with data, how they're able to invade our privacy without us even knowing about it, and how the major corporations like Disney and Murdoch and Vivendi and so on have actually started to move into the web commercially because they see it as a future. I mean, we've talked in this class before about the decline of television viewing and newspaper advertising and so on. The web is obviously the communications medium of the future, absolutely. Optimism of the web means that if people are aware of all these problems, are aware of the surveillance and are aware of the use of cookies and are aware of all the commercial realities of the web, we can still find a way to bend it to our own purpose and to have some optimism about the future.
Can you tell us what you mean by the term the public sphere? And in terms of the internet and multimedia journalism and online journalism, are you an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to the public sphere?
Well, the public sphere is really what you talk about as the national conversation. And that is the space, the public space, where people can actually get together and argue about and discuss and inform themselves about the major issues of the day, particularly those that affect them as individuals or them as members of a social class or a social group or as a family or whatever. So, for example, discussion of the foreshore and seabed issue in the New Zealand media, discussion of the Treaty of Waitangi and settlements around that, discussion of Winston Peters' donations to what happened to the money, all those kinds of important public issues are debated and discussed in the public sphere. And of course, around elections, for example, that's when this really kicks in, when policies and politics and personalities of the candidates are under much greater public scrutiny. And the media is, if you like, a bit of a filter there. In the olden days, in pre-industrial times, for example, the public sphere was literally a public place. It was the town square, or the town hall. It was the place where hangings would take place. It was the place where people who had transgressed social mores were put in stocks, and then, you could go along and chuck rotten fruit at them. It all took place in a very public space, literally, physical public space. I think today we've seen that the physical public space has been reduced. I mean, there was a story in the media a week or so ago about a council somewhere in New Zealand that had a finance committee meeting, took less than 2 minutes. There's no room for public intervention in that kind of space. But the virtual space now of the web is, if you like, the online public sphere. I think Mackenzie Walk, an Australian academic, said we no longer have roots, we have aerials. And I think you can actually update that now and say we no longer have aerials, we have Wi-Fi. So the public sphere now is actually a much more virtual kind of space.
How's that public space getting on, in your view, these days?
Well, I mean, you only have to look at what's happening around the Olympics in China. I mean, today, for example, there's a story, Kevin Gosper, who's the International Olympic Committee's media manager, having to apologise to more than 20,000 journalists who are going to be in Beijing over the next few weeks because the Chinese government has refused to give them unfettered access to the web. China has a national firewall around it. This is part of the pessimism, if you like. Countries like China, which have got dictatorial, repressive governments, can write a certain amount of code that they can just put around the pipe that takes the internet into China and block access to, say, for example, the Falun Gong site is one that's blocked. Amnesty International site is one that's blocked. I would imagine also Reporters Without Borders has probably been blocked, and the International Freedom of Expression Exchange is probably blocked. Even sites like the BBC are blocked in China. And the journalists who are going there, 21,000 of them, have basically, I think, quite rightly, kicked up a fuss about this because they were promised by Kevin Gosper that they would have unfettered access to the web. It turns out that the IOC had actually done a deal with the Chinese government to restrict access to certain sites that the Chinese government deems to be objectionable. So, I think that you can see that in terms of the virtual public sphere, it's not unfettered access. It's not just broadly open. It's not wholly democratic. There are blocks and filters put around what people can access on the web.
It's not that surprising in China, though, is it? What about New Zealand? How do you think that the internet is affecting our public sphere? Do you think it's going to improve or harm the processes of the upcoming general election in New Zealand?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I don't know the answer completely, but I can have a couple of guesses. In the United States, in the last few presidential elections, including this one that's going on at the moment, there's been several grassroots political organisations, particularly aimed at young people, first-time voters and so on, who are not traditional media consumers, as we know, trying to actually direct stuff at them through things like Facebook and Bebo and YouTube to get them to register to vote and to take the election seriously. And I think that that's probably paying some dividends. If you look at the groundswell of support for Barack Obama, for example, coming from college students and young black workers and so on, you can see that that's probably been quite effective. And there's a number of websites set up to try and organise that kind of young person's vote. Whether or not the political parties in New Zealand are up to speed with that and are able to capitalise on those kinds of technologies, I'm not sure. There has been a number of attempts to do things. I know that there's lots of stuff on YouTube about John Key, some of it very unflattering. There's a similar amount of material about Helen Clark that is very unflattering, and probably most of it is produced by party activists. So there are some attempts to do that. Is it good or bad? I think we won't know until we see what the turnout is in the election. If a lot of young people register to vote, a lot of young Māori in particular register to vote, maybe we could say that online campaigning has been successful. I think it's still probably in the very early stages in New Zealand, so it's hard to know what impact it might have on this year's election.